My name is Molly. I'm 18 years old, and I've only been at ISB 1.5 years. In this presentation, I'll be talking about the ways of knowing involved in theater and live performance. I've been involved in the theater for 5 years. With each play or performance I've been involved in, I have experienced the same phenomenon commonly known as stage fright. I've noticed the vast difference between performance and rehearsals and the nervousness that goes along with it. I've also been able to observe the differences in performance and rehearsal from both an acting and directing perspective. I believe that the two ways of knowing most involved in theater and live performance are emotion and sense perception. Learning about these two ways of knowing specifically have helped me to become more knowledgeable and aware of the emotional stress and the adrenaline rush associated with stage fright. Looking back on my performance in the fall musical this year, I now realize I was relying heavily on both perception and emotion as ways of knowing during the rehearsals and performances. Before the musical this fall, I had next to no experience singing in front of an audience, let alone singing and dancing and acting at the same time. This lack of experience made me extremely nervous, during rehearsals, especially as we moved closer to the show date. The amount of nervous energy I was harboring hindered my performance in the rehearsals. However, when the show date rolled around and the show opened, the amount of adrenaline or arousal far outweighed my nervousness. I sang through all my songs without any problems. Evaluating my performance at a later date and during rehearsals in comparison to the live performances, I now see that I was far too nervous in comparison to my adrenaline level to perform well. The extra adrenaline provided by the live audience was the extra push of awareness that I needed to put on a good show. In other words, during the rehearsals, I was not aroused enough to give a good performance, whereas during the live shows, I was. In the future, knowing how nervousness hinders a performance and the bell curve associated with arousal versus performance, I may be able to calm myself or arouse myself to the appropriate arousal level to improve my performances as an actress. From a directing standpoint, I got an outlook on the emotion and perception I'd experienced as a performer from the outside. I directed 448 Psychosis by Sarah Kane for my IB theater class. We had a little over 24 hours to direct and create a 10-minute piece of theater. I was so lucky to get such a talented pair of students for my show. While both Olivia and Scott were very experienced in theater, they both still struggle, as all performers do, with the performance versus arousal aspect of doing something in front of a crowd or under pressure. 448 Psychosis was a very raw piece of theater and dealt with very sensitive matters such as self-harm, suicide, and schizophrenia. Olivia was the main character, and who went through all of these things. She had to imagine and recall times where she felt similarly to the character. Doing this was very hard for her emotionally. As a director, it was my job not to let her get in too deep with such powerful and triggering aspects of the mindset of the character. Emotionally, she had a tendency of letting herself get distracted from the character with her own personal problems. Although Stanislavski wasn't the practitioner I used as a guide in direction for my piece, I think his method and practice of tempo rhythm assisted Olivia in finding middle ground for her and her character. Stanislavski said that tempo is the speed that you do in action, and rhythm is the intensity that you carry it out with. We all have multiple tempo rhythms. We have an internal and an external tempo rhythm. For example, you may be sitting on a bench alone with a very low external tempo rhythm, while inside you're in panic with a very high tempo rhythm. Stanislavski also observed an opening night phenomenon, which he described as the tempo rhythm of the actor being higher, more nervous than the tempo rhythm of the character, which hindered the believability of the character and the performance in general. Stanislavski and his students strove to find a balance between their tempo rhythm and the tempo rhythm of their character. Olivia often would overplay the role externally while her internal tempo rhythm was far lower than what she displayed on the outside. In order to create believability in the character, we had to increase her internal arousal to match the outside. We used several pumping up exercises and breathing exercises to help Olivia create an external and internal energy that matched. Using Stanislavski's theory of tempo rhythm, I was able to help Olivia create enough arousal internally without having her go over the edge. By creating a balance between her internal and external and her character's tempo rhythm, she was able to overcome an imbalance of arousal which would hinder her performance. As for Scott, his character was completely internal. His challenge was keeping his movements very slow and measured. His internal arousal or tempo rhythm had to be far greater than his external. He struggled with rushing into actions his character was assigned because of his external energy being too high. Excuse me. I worked with him using relaxation techniques to increase his focus on the internal aspects of his character and to reduce the amount of arousal he was displaying. Through the methods I used to reduce the arousal in him, he was able to overcome the imbalance of his character that he was struggling with. I feel like as a director, I have grown immensely from my experience with Scott and Olivia, using the perception and emotional ways of knowing as a guide in understanding where they were with their character. You see, it is the perception of the crowd that creates a situation of over-arousal and an emotional package of fear that enhances the perception. For Olivia, emotional packages of regret and guilt related to her personal problems led her to a place of over-arousal and then a place of withdrawal. Then it was perception of society's stigma for these issues she'd gone through that led to even more packages not to be fired or to be fired. As for Scott, his perception of himself led for a package of anxiousness and anxiety to be released, which hindered his performance. I feel like knowing these ways of knowing has increased my competence as a director, an actor, and as a person.